welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. No matter where it is that you're joining us from, the advantage of having COVID, I guess if there are any advantages, is that we could easily join each other virtually now more than ever before, right? Zero excuses. So wherever it is that you're joining us from, thank you for carving out time to join this distinguished group of panelists. We have about an hour and a half. We have 90 minutes dedicated to a topic that is not only relevant to the times, but relevant to all the panelists in here. And in one way or the other, it's part of our lives because we all happen to be Latinos, Hispanos, and we care about our community. And I hope that if you joined today, you were driven by the interest to either learn more insights about the U.S. Hispanic cohort and some of the cultural and ethnic, the cultural nuances and ethnic terminology that applies to this segment. So before we get into the dialogue and start this dialogue, I do want to highlight to everybody in this call that we will be discussing some cultural sensitive matters. And in that respect, I'd like to remind all of us to be respectful, to be mindful, to listen, to seek to understand the other's perspective. And, we're not here to create consensus. We're here to actually listen to different perspectives, and hopefully we could come out more educated from this experience with each other. Ultimately, we have to remember that we have all reached our conclusions on no matter what topic it is, right? We all reach our conclusions and we all form our thoughts in an honest approach, right? We don't just wake up and build opinions just for the sake of being mean. We've all reached our opinions and our thoughts in an honest way. So with that being said, I'd like to create a little bit of what I'm going to do is I'm going to kick this off by creating a little bit of context of how we got into this panel. And then I'm going to go through each of the panelists and introduce them one by one. And they have different sections of the slide what they're going to address them for. And I'll ask each of the panelists to spend 3 to 5 minutes in this first round, so that after this first round, then we can continue into all the topics. By popular demand, I think the first topic that we're going to enter is the topic of the term LatinX. A lot of folks gave us their feedback that they were interested in seeing the data and insights on this terminology. And I think we're going to start with that. We're going to spend probably 20 minutes on that. And then we're going to pivot into further Hispanic insights, whether it's cultural, in the marketplace, and in the future of the Hispanic population. So the first thing that you should know is that this journey started with the board of Hacemos really talking about a brand, refreshing the brand. And just, I'm going to go real quickly through this, maybe 5 minutes. If anybody wants a full report, I'll give it to them at the end of this webinar. Ask me. It's a 40-page report, so that's why we're not going to go through 40 pages right now. Aren't you glad that we're not going to do 40 pages of PowerPoint right now? I hope you are. So we started with wanting, after 32 years of being an organization, we wanted to understand and potentially rebrand ourselves. And we thought about, well, should we include the word Hispanic? Should we include the word Latino? Should we include the word LatinX? We were not sure. So we turned around to survey our members and to evaluate the collective sentiment of our members. As we were going through this process, the Hispanic Corporate Council of Atlanta, the HCCA, which is a consortium of 43 ERGs in Atlanta, several ERGs were asking the same questions. So we between the HCCA and Hacemos, we reached out to Hispanic Executive, which they happen to have a sociologist on staff, and we built a survey that we could give to both of our organizations and try to get some insights on the collective sentiment of this. So that's a little bit of the context, right? It's always important to understand these cohorts in its multifaceted colors, because at the end of the day, the Latino Hispanic population in the U.S. has grown significantly, right? If you look at the trends right now, we are the fastest growing minority cohort in the U.S., outpacing the Black community, outpacing the Asian community, Frankly, I'm placing all others. Everybody else, only the Asians and Hispanics seem to be growing. Everybody else is flat or declining. Here's another way to look at that illustration. And this is only to point out at a high level, right, the relevance more than ever of the Hispanic segment when it comes to business, when it comes to marketers, when it comes to anybody trying to connect to this community, because this is how America is changing today, and it's going to continue to change demographically in the future. As you think about an executive summary of the survey that we did to our 1,600 SMOs members and our 511 ACCA members who responded, at a high level, what you need to remember is that when they were asked about their preferred terms, Hispanic came to be on top as their preferred term, Latino came to be on second on top, and less than 2% resonated with the term Latinx. It's also important to point out that about 50% of the respondents did not feel offended if they were misidentified with one of these terms. And about 25% have really had a 50-50 mixed feelings about how they feel if they were misidentified. As we were thinking about some of the reflections of what this means, we thought that it was interesting to see that 82% had a proclivity to remain neutral when it comes to this. We found it's also very important to find out that our cohorts of survey was limited to professionals, and ultimately the goal, right, was to help us try to think about how to refresh our brand and how to connect meaningfully with our members, and also help marketers and businesses connect to that segment. As we continue to research this topic, we find out that our survey, when they give us their feedback, there were a lot of strong emotions on both sides. People that were for some terms, people that were against some terms. And at the end of the day, it was a very, very insightful gathering of data that I'll be happy to share with any of you. Email me afterwards, and I'll send you the PDF so that you look at some of the commentary that was shared by the participants. From an ACCA perspective, if you look at it, this is the high level. I'm not going to get granular on this data, but I just wanted to give you a sense of how the split was in terms of the participants. And actually, from an SMO's perspective, it was basically the data was around the same thing. Now, we were able to find one more study that was done back in 2018 by this organization called We're All Humans, where there were about 212 different professionals, Latino professionals. And you could see that when they were asked whether they prefer to be called Latino or Hispanic, if it mattered to them, the great majority, 68%, said that it didn't matter whether they were called Hispanic or Latino. And then when you added the term Latinx to it, it still showed that the great majority preferred to be called Hispanic or Latino. We actually went online to find out more data on this topic, to find out, we were able to find a lot of opinions and a lot of carefully thought out opinions on this topic, but it was hard to find out data on it. So one of the articles that I was able to find out, one of the studies that I was able to find out came from Think Now Research, and their CEO, Mario Carrasco, is here with us. And, I bumped into one of his articles that was actually picked up by the New York Times, the Washington Post, by Fortune Magazine. This was something that was published, I think it was back in October of 2019, Mario, is that correct? And it was around the context of several of the Democratic candidates in their campaign were using the term Latinx. And your team decided to do research on this and cue that. So why don't you run us a little bit through some of the findings on that research?
So you mentioned, by the way, my name is Mario Carrasco, co-founder of Think Now. We specialize in multicultural research, Hispanic, African American, and Asians in the U.S. And of course, large portion of our business focused on U.S. Hispanics. And so when we first did the study that Giovanni mentioned in 2019, we've actually done 2 studies. That was the first one. And it was really something driven by a client need. We were asked by the NBA about this, and that's when we decided to actually do some research about, what do Latinos in the U.S. prefer how do they prefer to describe themselves? So very similar to the work that Hacemos did. However, the sample is very different, right? Ours was a nationwide representative survey of 508 U.S. Hispanics. So we weighted it by the 4 census regions, the 9 subregions, by income, by education. So you have a much more representative sample than the previous study. And the 2019 study got way bigger than we had expected. Like Giovanni mentioned, got picked up by the New York Times, Washington Post. Wasn't our intent. We publish content on a regular basis. So if you go to thinknow.com, we have studies ranging from auto purchase intent to CPG. So this was another one of those studies, and we had no idea that it would resonate so broadly and be picked up by the press. And so what we found in 2019 was really similar to what Hacemos had found. Could we go back to the previous slide, please, Giovanni? What we found was that Hispanic was by far the most preferred term, how Hispanics in the U.S. would like to be referred to, then followed by Latino, Latina, country of origin. And then you go down to Latinx, there's about 2% overall. This study, because it was picked up so widely, got picked apart online. And so while everything in this sample was weighted and representative like all of our other studies, because it got such large attention, we actually decided to do a follow-up study in 2020. And we doubled the base size, and we got some criticism that was actually valid. One of the criticisms that we internalized and then wanted to do again was to make sure that we had a readable base size of respondents that identified as Latinx, and also that identified as either gay, lesbian, or non-binary. So we made sure to include a base size that over-index in reference to the population. And even when we redid that in January of 2020, we saw almost the same exact result, which made us feel good from a research perspective, right? That we had set up the sample frame correctly, and the study was consistent with an entirely new batch of respondents. And again, Hispanic was preferred overall, with Latino and Latina coming in second, and then again, Latinx at 2%. And you would expect that as you go into perhaps younger generational cohorts like Millennial, Gen Z, there would be an increase for Latinx in terms of preference, and the research actually didn't bear that out. So you can see here across the board, the highest that it got was 3%. So among 18 to 24-year-olds, the preference for Latinx was at 3%. Not much change in terms of income. And this graph is a little bit misleading. It looks like big sweeps, but you're looking at the x-axis here from 0 to 3%, right? So that skew that you're seeing is from 1% to 3%. So 3% being the highest preference. And there's actually no statistical significance here in terms of difference. So we thought that was really interesting, and we wanted to publish this to give best practices to companies. Of course, we primarily work with Fortune 1000s. We also work with government agencies, CDC, US Army, and political campaigns when they're reaching out to Hispanics, to reach out to them and identify them in terms that they prefer. And so while, Latinx may be something that's gaining steam, right now, looking at the U.S. Hispanic market, it really isn't a term that's gotten above 3% preference. And again, and then we also dug into on the second study how they felt, how Latinos in the U.S. felt about the term, and again, pretty similar to the Hacemos research in that they don't necessarily find it offensive. they're for the most part fine with the term, but some don't like the term very much, so Hispanic is really, again, kind of the top in terms of what Hispanics in the U.S. like to be, how they like to be referred to.
Well, thank you, Mario, for giving that. I mean, one of the things that we, as we were researching this further, right, we stumble upon this graphic where we see when the hashtag Latinx, researching for Latinx, peaked. And I think it's important to mention this, that, it was a term that originally started back in 2004. And then in June 2016, it peaked in Google searches. And that was the time during the Orlando, Florida mass shooting in Club Pulse, right? Most of the clients of Club Pulse were our brothers, LGBTQ Latinos in there. And that's where the hashtag Latinx came out to, peak during the Google search. So as I bump into this Google search, I wanted to reach out to the friends that I knew at Google. And this is where I came into Julissa. Julissa and I are both were awarded the recognition of being part of the Hispanic Corporate Council of Responsibility under the Young Latino Stars, which of our companies picked us. AT&T picked me, Google picked her, and I was like, well, let me reach out to her. Also, she knows she's very entrenched in the community. She also runs a nonprofit called Listas in the Bay Area. And she's also very involved, like myself, in the Hispanic ERG within Google. So, Julissa, can you give us a little bit of context on how Hola, how Google is embracing all this different terminology? How are you guys wrestling with this topic?
Yeah, I think similar to all of you, especially you, Giovanni, we are looking at how do we name certain councils, or how do we name certain things within internally, events even. And the reality is that the reason why we have decided, or at least speaking for myself, the term Latinx is because the term Latinx was born out of a space of inclusion. Whether you identify with it, and I understand the data, only 2% of people identify with Latinx. I myself identify as Latina. But when I say the Latina, Google network, or when I say the Latino Google network, there is still, even if it's 2% of our population, a small subset that feels excluded. So I think there is an understanding of how do we create or use a term that is all inclusive, right? At Google, at least from my experience, and also we were looking at this when I worked at Intel, I do think that we are adopting that term of Latinx more so than going towards Latino or Hispanic.
Now, the HOLA, is that an acronym for anything?
HOLA used to be an acronym when it started. My Google assistant is talking. No, HOLA used to be an acronym when the organization started, but as we decided to let go of any acronyms and just let it be a welcoming word. HOLA.
Interesting. Can you give us some insight as to how you guys arrived to that conclusion?
Because the original HOLA included Hispanic, it just felt like it was excluding our Brazilian population and our other non-Spanish speaking, Latino population. So it just became too complicated, and we were like, well, HOLA is such a great word. Now, we will say though that even within HOLA, we are having issues where you don't say HOLA in Portuguese per se. So even that word HOLA is exclusive in some ways. And we are thinking of ways to address that in the future. Interesting.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting that you guys pivoted away from an acronym and into just a word. Hacemos has been, for 32 years, has been an organization, and Hacemos was never an acronym. But in prior iterations, there were acronyms that were used by the organization, and I'm kind of glad that we landed with a word, right? Hacemos, which it translates to "we do." And as I engage all the different ERGs, and they ask me for advice, that's the advice that I gave them. It's like, step away from ethnic terminology and stick to a word that could be as most inclusive and representative as possible of your members. So that might be some really good advice for this audience over here as they think about engaging and rebranding themselves as a BERG. So thank you so much, Elisa, for providing those insights. So another person that I wanted to bring into this conversation was my friend David Perez, who David is the Senior Director of Donor Relations at the Hispanic Federation. David is also part of the LatinX Institute, and he has invited me personally to several of his events. And I've seen the term Latinx used very often in all the terms that he's a part of. And I figure he will be a perfect person to bring into this panel and to give us context and perspective from his world. Hey, David, welcome.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it. Well, as you mentioned, I think along with Julisa's lines, like in terms of inclusion, is kind of where I feel like the conversation is. I come more for the nonprofit sector, so not as much as the business perspective. But I volunteer with Unión Equals Fuerza Latinx Institute, and Hispanic Federation has been a partner supporting that as well. So we started around 2013, just bringing a space together of LGBTQ Latinx people. And, when we started, we used Latino, Latina, like with the arroba, right, at the end with the @ symbol. So for me, when I was in college, I know a lot of the Latino student groups had the @ symbol or the arroba to try to have an inclusion of men and women. That seemed to me not really to take off online a lot. I know that other books were then published trying to be inclusive of Latino and Latina men and women and use Latino/Latina, so O/A. So again, it was kind of an idea of inclusion. I would say since 2014 is when our institute started using the word Latinx. They started a hashtag Latinx Improved when we met in Denver, Colorado. And that was our intersectionality committee, which was tasked with having more inclusion in our movement. So basically, from then, we kind of changed our name to the Latinx Institute, permanently putting the X there. So I think so in English, like a lot of folks will say Latinx. A lot of folks, speaking Spanish will use an E instead of an A or O, right? So I think for me, language is like about who you're communicating with and being inclusive. So I think always depends who you're speaking to and in what context. And so for us, since we're there with many non-binary folks, transgender folks who would say, could you please speak in this way to be inclusive of us? And we're like, sure, of course we're down for that. Of course, we'd like to signal that we're going to do that. I've always worked at Latino civil rights organizations since about 2007. So we always use Hispanic, Latino interchangeably and put a note at the bottom of the report or the release, right? Because, maybe in New Mexico, my grandmother's from Albuquerque, so she used the Hispanic a lot. I grew up in Southern California. I used Latino a lot, So I think there's a lot of folks that like different things and being inclusive, as possible. But it all depends, I feel like, in the moment who you're talking to, and not saying like someone has to use the word Latinx to describe themselves. But sometimes in the nonprofit leadership role, you can't signal, we want to be inclusive, we hear you, and we see you.
And help us clarify, because one of the things that I found out in our survey was that there was the participants, the 2,000 participants of the survey, there was a lot of confusion of what the term Latinx stands for. Can you provide this audience a definition of it?
I mean, I think the main idea is to be a gender neutral term. So for example, in Spanish, I might be a Latino male, or there might be a Latina woman. So as I think Mario mentioned earlier, some folks identify as, gender nonconforming. So they might use they, them pronouns instead of he or she pronouns. So Latinx is a way to not say you have to be in a binary gender one way. You can be inclusive of folks. Also, I think from a feminist perspective, so all the words aren't ending in O, a male, kind of way. Also, some folks, again, in Spanish will use the E, the letter E instead as well.
And so one of the feedbacks that we got in this question was, well, like, okay, so if this is about gender neutrality, what about using terms like Latin or Hispanic? Are they not neutral in the English language?
Well, I think with Hispanic, you get back to Julisa's situation where, depending who you're talking about, it's, Spanish speaking, Latin America, right? You have those issues with Latino, Hispanic. I mean, is a gender neutral term. All I know is growing up in California, Mexican American, Chicano movement, like, Latin, Hispanic. I mean, most people I grew up with wouldn't prefer those terms, but I don't have great research like marketers and y'all.
Yeah, well, it gave me flashback of my college days. In my college days, in 1999, 2003, the great debate back there was, are you Hispanic or are you Latino, right? And I think Julissa even mentioned this. And I just remember there were very passionate dialogues and opinions being shared by both sides. And I was taking it all in. And frankly, I was challenged to be like, hey, which one are you? I didn't even thought about it. I was like, you know what? My spirit of the whole thing was like, call me whatever you want, Hispanic or Latino, but just call me with the opportunity, right? That was, for me, that was more essential for me, right? Call me whatever, but just show me whatever box you want to check. I'll check it, but just give me the opportunity to move forward as an individual, So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Julissa.
I just wanted to say that there is a difference between Hispanic and Latino. The term Hispanic is a term that was for people living in the United States who speak Spanish. And that was a government term created. Whereas Latino is a term that is from Latin America, people that are from Latino American countries. So there is a difference. So when you identify as Hispanic and you're a Spanish speaking person, for example, someone from Spain can be Hispanic, but from someone from Spain can't be Latino. It's like a difference. And then when you go and say, are you Latin? Then technically someone from Spain can be Latin because they speak a Latin language, Latin-based language. And also, I also want to provide that for the X is also used as a, what do they call it? Like a variable letter. So it could be anything, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. I think I couldn't have coordinated that better. That's a perfect transition to our last panelist. Our Ricardo Gonzalez continues to be a welcome guest back into our SEMOS webinars. He has been with us before. Actually, he came to our national ERG conference about 2-3 years ago, and he gave us a very impactful webinar on the 6 stages of cultural mastery. He's the owner and founder of Bilingual America. And Ricardo, I think you also own SpeakSpanish.com. Is that what it is?
SpeakSpanish.com, yes. Our next one will be SpanishForHispanics.com. That's the one. Now we have to change it to Spanish for LatinX.com, right? So we'll see where we go with that. Culture changes, it shifts. So. Well,
I thought it was very important to include you in this conversation, Ricardo, because indeed, right, language is a cultural phenomenon. How would you, I happen to know that you're a linguist as well, right? Besides being a CEO and an author, you happen to be a linguist. Can you give us some insight in the actual, technical linguistics of the terms?
Sure. So it's called a neologism, right? Which is coming from neo, new, and logos, word. So basically it means a new word. And it's a new word that has not been accepted fully into the mainstream, okay? And that's why you're seeing now this 2%, okay? Which, if you were to get on forums, I think it's fascinating to me because I look at things from a cultural standpoint primarily. That's really my life work. If we were to be having the same exact conversation in Latin America, for example, we would be doing this in Spanish. And very frankly, I live in Latin America, and so it's just not a conversation. This is a conversation that is predominantly among Spanish speakers or even people of Hispanic descent in the United States. And so it's a very different conversation.
And Ricardo, you positioned it so well within kind of a global framework. And I'm curious, are there any other countries or languages kind of grappling with the issues presented with having a gendered language, or is the US leading that, or are there other countries further ahead on us in that conversation and then taking steps like creating more inclusive terms like Latinx?
Mario, I love the term only in America. This is really driven by Americans at this point.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
These are not conversations that are being held around business meetings in Latin America, Latin American-owned business companies. Now,
well,
there are multinational companies that are based in the United States who may take that to Latin America. You know, that's another conversation culturally.
Yeah, but I mean, even outside of Latin America, though, I was just thinking, you know, like you meant, you know,
it's not a conversation in Italy.
Yeah.
It's not a conversation in Russia for sure. It's not a conversation in Germany, you know, where you have other gender-based languages.
Very interesting.
But to me that makes sense, right? Because there's no other country with the level of multicultural ethnicity variety that we have in the U.S. So do we think that's the X factor over here in terms of the U.S.?
You know, I don't take positions on these things. I just study culture, right? Look what's happening. So I'm just trying to answer the question. I think that the United States is a very unique. It's a very unique country. You know, there are some other countries like Great Britain right now that have this amount of diversity. There's a great amount of diversity in India, right? But the conversation in India is around other languages, like, you know, do we use Farsi or do we, you know, and so it's a different conversation, right? I think sometimes people in America feel like we're kind of the center of the world, right? But there are 1.3 billion people in India, you know, and they have like 4 times the populace we do. And so it's just, I try to see things from a different lens in my world of just studying and understanding.
David, you want to chime in?
Sure. Well, I mean, so again, I don't come from the business perspective, more with nonprofits and activists. So, I mean, when we're speaking in Spanish, I mean, a lot of the folks we're with here, grew up in Latin America, speak Spanish. So we have our meetings, you can speak in English or Spanish. When we talk also with activists from Latin America, I mean, I think you see here with the E, as I was mentioning, when folks are speaking in Spanish, they use an E, not an X, like when they're speaking in English. So it's just, again, about inclusion, no matter if you're speaking in English, Spanish. There's different movements. I think before feminist movements, now there's some LGBT movements, testing different ways with language to be inclusive. And I think, what sticks and what will be here in 15, 20 years, we'll see. I feel like the @ symbol, the arroba, really didn't stick that hard. So, it'll be interesting to see. But I also have never, as I mentioned earlier, I haven't heard folks be like, you have to identify this way. And I don't think people either identify just one way. Because I might say I'm Latino, I'm Latinx, I'm Mexican American. I can be all these things and identify in all these ways. So, as Julie said, different governments made up different terms, different ways to describe language and who we are. And I think how people want to identify themselves, is fine, and we shouldn't force it on someone. I think as nonprofits, we'll be leading with inclusion, setting the tone. Businesses, I think, are coming from a much different angle, right? And probably going to base their decisions on market research based on what population they're trying to speak to at that time in that particular communication.
Can I follow up on what David said, Giovanni?
Yeah, please, go ahead.
So if you pivot this to business, right? Let's take the Hispanic world or Latin world or Latinx world, whatever one wants to call it. If someone says to me, I want you to consider me Latinx, I'm happy to do so, right? That doesn't take anything away from me. That's what they want. I'm happy to do that, okay? If that becomes the dominant term, so be it. Culture will dictate that, right? But if I'm a marketer, I'm a CMO of a Fortune 500 company, and I want to reach, let's say, Puerto Ricans, which, by the way, I would like you to call me Puerto Rican. I don't want to be called Hispanic, or I call me Puerto Rican. That's what I am, okay? That's a very different marketing approach than, say, marketing to people from Guatemala. I mean, we're from how many different countries? 22 different countries. So even though we have a common language, we have very distinct cultures. And to lump us all together into this kind of homogenous type of language or approach to us, I think is a mistake.
Can I add to that? I think this is such a difficult issue, right? When thinking about addressing people from the lens of internal to my company, let's say Hola members. For me to say, sometimes I have to say Latino, Latina, Latinx plus Hispanic. And I'm like, it's just so hard to like bucket all of us into one terminology. But also, I do recognize that sometimes using Latinx is not necessarily as inclusive as I want it to be. So sometimes by me saying, hola, the Google Latinx community or whatever, it's excluding a lot of people that really, really don't want to be identified that way. I just feel like it's understanding the nuances of how individualistic self-identification is. And for me as a person trying to speak to a mass, picking a term that will bucket all of us is just so difficult. I'm just gonna start saying, hi, hola humans or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, and Ricardo, Julissa, like those points you're spot on, right? And I think ultimately when it goes to, right, is the imperfectness or really the construct of race and ethnicity, right? Because outside of gender now, you look at intersectionality, you look at Afro-Latinas, Afro-Latino, from and David's right? From a marketing perspective, it's a very different thing when you're trying to reach as many people as possible. But I do think that there is a push in marketing, and personally, I think it's great to be more specific, right? Because we're starting to see people are getting much more savvy and sniffing out inauthenticity. And the more authentic you are in terms of reaching your consumer, whether you're Puerto Rican, for example, I identify as Mexican American, and I think the more that companies and nonprofits, for that matter, and government organizations understand their consumers and um, more specifically target, an interesting thing happens, right? The more specific you are, I mean, you think about content, right? I mean, thinking about Netflix or any kind of movie, the more specific a movie, it has an interesting phenomenon where it becomes more universal. And I think that's what's starting to happen here when we talk about that. We're butting up against the realization that race is and ethnicity is an imperfect construct, and it's hard to encapsulate that with words.
We've done
Go ahead, Ricardo.
we've done a lot of work in the construction and manufacturing industries in development of Latino leaders within those organizations on a national scale. And when we first go into a company, it's very difficult to see a group of Mexicans having lunch with a group of people from Guatemala, right? And so you come into this stark realization that, or you get Costa Ricans together with Nicaraguans who have been at war together, right? And you come into this realization that we are not one big happy group of homogenous people, because that's our reality, as whether we call ourselves Hispanics, Latinos, Latinas, Latinx, whatever moniker we want to put on ourselves. The reality is we're from 22 different countries, and if you add the U.S., 23, and the U.S. is the third largest Spanish-speaking populace in the world, and our economy is, I think you had it in your data there, Giovanni, if we were a country, we'd have the 7th largest economy in the world right now. It's amazing what Hispanics are doing in the United States. I think we shouldn't get lost in the little letter or word we call each other, and let's leverage our unbelievable potential. We shouldn't get lost in this.
So I think that's really a good transition there, Ricardo. I really wanted to start this dialogue with that cultural terminology of Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, because our audience has a craving for this, very much like, they reacted to Mario's article. I know that a lot of the folks in this webinar had a craving for this as well. But overall, right, it's kind of like you said, this is only one aspect of the U.S. Hispanic. What other insights can you guys as panelists, can you provide about the U.S. Hispanic market here in the U.S.? And Mario, maybe you will be a good start. I know you had a really powerful example regarding the car manufacturers. Maybe you'd like to share that with us.
Yeah. So what Giovanni is referring to, we did a really great study, and because Giovanni was asking me to share a story that encapsulates what we do at Think Now, and I can share the study because it was a published study. Honda won an award for the marketing campaign that they created based on some of the insights that we helped them with. And in short, what we did some work with them regarding truck ownership among Latinos in the U.S. And for those people that don't know, Honda is one of the top brands consistently among U.S. Hispanics. They've invested a lot of marketing dollars and time in creating that relationship. And another stat in regards to automotive is that Latinos in the U.S. are one of the top purchasers of pickup trucks. However, Honda wanted to understand they have a pickup truck, the Ridgeline, that wasn't resonating with Latinos, and you would think that being a top brand among Hispanics, that buying their truck would be a natural extension of that. So we did some work around not necessarily why they weren't purchasing the Honda brand, but more about what is behind this trend of Latinos over-indexing in pickup trucks purchase. And so we did some online qualitative research, followed it up by quantitative research, and what we found in the qualitative portion when we were having discussions was that if you think about, you think about kind of the general market, one of the things that most people dread owning a pickup truck is getting that phone call like, hey, are you available this weekend? I'm moving, right? I mean, you talk to most people and you're laughing because like, you don't want to be that guy. You don't want to be called, or that girl. You don't want to be called.
I've made that call a couple of times.
Move, right? But in our research, what was really interesting is that we found the opposite was true for U.S. Hispanics. One of the reasons that they purchase pickup trucks is they like being that person in their friend and family group to help out. And this is not necessarily about moving, to help out in general, right? Pick up a large item. They like being the go-to. And what that points to is an aspect of culture, right? To Ricardo's point about collectivism, right? That is something that does unite Latino culture, right? This idea of collectivism versus individualism in the U.S. And that plays itself out very differently in the U.S. among U.S. Hispanics generationally. But even when we look at second, third generation, bicultural, bilingual, English dominant Hispanics, there is remnants of that collectivist culture. And Honda used that insight and created a really great campaign around being that person in the family and friend circle that was the go-to. So I know that's a little bit outside of the conversation in terms of terms, but I think it does point to a solution about, not necessarily making it a term-based outreach, but, looking at what unites us from a cultural perspective and using that versus terminology.
I love that.
It's just beautiful. Can I jump in? I'm going to follow up. I'm going to follow up on David. So in the world of culture, it's called high context culture. So that in the high context culture, as opposed to a low context culture, which mainstream US is low context, but a high context culture is a culture that is driven by relationships. The relationship is more important than the result, right? And so, but one of the things about high context culture is people get their sense of self-identity through the group. Thus, I want to be the go-to person, right? Because I'm not helping you, you're helping me. You're giving me a sense of identity because my DNA as a high context person or in a high context culture is I need the group. I need the group. By the way, the antidote to gang activity among these high context cultures is better groups. The reason that people get into gangs is because they're not properly connected to other people who can really be good for them. And so they're still going to connect to the group. So in my consulting with police forces, I've always said to them, if you want to do proactive work, just simply create better groups. It beats the heck out of prison, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that in some ways we've got it so backwards, but where that leads, I'll stop with this, is if you look at the leadership model within the U.S. business environment, it's typically fairly hierarchical, right? So if you look at an org chart, it's CEO, and then you've got your C-suite, and then you've got your vice presidents or presidents, and then vice presidents, and so on and so forth, right? We found in our studies and in our work with Latinos in manufacturing and in construction that a lot of times the best people who were suited to be leaders didn't want to be leaders. When we started studying this in depth, here's what we found out. They would say to us, I don't want to be a leader because I got to go back and I got to live with these people. And what they were essentially saying to me is, you're taking me out of my group. Well, that's where I get my sense of identity. So what we did was we recalibrated the entire leadership experience, and we started telling Latinos, okay, we're doing away with this hierarchical, and this is a hub. You just happen to be at the center of the hub, and you're making the wheel move. And when we started positioning leadership in that language for Latinos, it was like, let me in. And I think that there's insight there for corporate leaders, especially for people maybe who are in the labor sector.
Well, I think you both have provided fantastic insights into the Hispanic cohort. Julissa and David, maybe do you have any other insights that you want to share? Julissa, I saw your hand out.
Yeah, I wanted to share that from the perspective of the ERG. What we do for Hola is we call ourselves Hola, the Google Familia. And then when you look at our three pillars are cultivating leaders, cultivating familia, and extending Google's reach. So even within the way that we position ourselves in the company, we focus on cultural values that we have as Latin people. That's all.
Thank you. David?
Nothing at this time to add this one, but some great.
Has the Hispanic Federation tapped into any key topics that they're tackling on as an organization for the U.S. Hispanic?
Right now we're really focused on COVID relief, of course. So we started a fund with Lin-Manuel Miranda, who has been raised about $11 million so far. So we provide capacity building support to Latino nonprofits. We also have a minority business initiative with Hennessy, and we have direct cash assistance. So we're really looking at, I think, if you look at Latinos and mixed status families, some who might be undocumented, some who might not be documented, the federal government excluded families who were U.S. citizens from receiving stimulus money if one person in their family wasn't undocumented status. So there was a lot of folks in need of these other supports that weren't being provided. So we have direct cash assistance programs helping with rent, with housing. So that's really been our focus right now during COVID. And I think just bringing up with different late night talk show hosts and folks to be thinking about Latinos, and particularly in New York, where it was hit really hard as our headquarters, how Latinos have been affected, what investment are we making, but also thinking about what institutions and problems were there before COVID and how those kind of been brought to light, that we might need better policies to be more inclusive of certain folks in federal programs or other safety nets in society. And we really work with Latino serving nonprofits to make sure that they're equipped to help serve those most vulnerable populations. We do it through federal advocacy with the government, state advocacy, as well as capacity building and direct service.
Gotcha. And I'll ask this question before I transition to questions from our audience. We have about 112 audience members who are joining us for this webinar. I'll ask you if you have any questions to any of our panelists. Please put it in the chat box. Maybe start with the name of the person you like to address it. That makes it easier for me to read. And then I'll see how I could carve out some time here to address all your questions. But before we transition to that, I'll pose this question to you guys. We're in 2020 already, right? Let's fast forward 20 years from now, maybe 30 years from now, 2050. What does a U.S. Hispanic population look like? What will be the major topics of interest? Are we going to be debating LatinX in 2050? Or maybe something else? Think about it. What insights can you guys give us in terms of where we're heading and what does the future of the U.S. Hispanic look like?
I can kind of take that to start off from a demographic perspective. So, I mean, as a multicultural marketer, and I'm sure, many people on this board know the stats, right? Hispanic are the largest, minority group in the U.S. Asian Americans are the fastest growing. And I think a statistic that's not really talked about is that mixed race is actually the fastest growing demographic. When you look at, Gen Z has the highest mixed race percentage we've ever seen in this country. And another stat that's kind of underreported is that U.S. Hispanics are the most likely to intermarry and have, and be a mixed race. And so I think that's going to really define the U.S. Hispanic population. And I alluded to that earlier in terms of intersectionality, right? Afro-Latino, Hispanic, Asian American. I think it's going to, again, poke holes in this race and ethnicity construct, right? Because if you start to look at influencers, young influencers on TikTok, Instagram that are interracial, many of them identify with both cultures, right? And so you talk about complexity with just U.S. Latino and 22 country of origins. Now throw in interracial, it's going to be really, really complex. So I think for me, that's going to be one of the defining characteristics is kind of mixed race, mixed culture, bilingual, triculture, right? Looking at my family, my wife is Sri Lankan, my kids are Sri Lankan, Mexican, American, right? I mean, how are they going to identify?
Wow.
So I'll keep you posted. They're 6 and 4 right now. We'll see.
That's cool.
That just goes into this. This is, Giovanni knows this. I mean, it just underscores the absolute need within our society to develop a culturally healthy mindset and skill set. If in masses our people do not become culturally healthy and skilled, our country will be in significant, we're seeing it, right? And obviously this is not just a Hispanic thing, or it's not a multiracial thing. We're having incredible tensions in our country right now racially, but racism is a symptom of a deeper cultural dysfunction in our relationships, right? And so if we continue just to simply address the symptoms, we'll never get to the root issue and we'll never really heal. And I think that there has to be a time now where we get serious about developing ourselves as it relates to our cultural mindset, and that is how we view one another, which would then in turn address things like bias and stereotype and prejudice and all of these things, and also our skill set. When we talk about cultural skill set, it's how do we connect with one another? How do we create together? How do we collaborate together at the highest levels? And very honestly, we just don't have these skills. Mario, I love the fact that you have so much data. We've run a lot of data recently with leaders on, in fact, we did this with Giovanni's group on cultural health and skill. And we haven't had a group of leaders yet on a scale of 1 to 10 test over 6 as it relates to cultural health and skill. So this, I think, has to be our next main significant movement. Multiculturalism is here. Diversity is here. Those things are not in question any longer. What's in question is, will we develop the cultural health that we need? Will we develop the skill set and the mindset we need to be able to bring ourselves to our highest potential? That's what's in question.
I think to that point, Ricardo, like myself, I identify as Afro-Latina. And to know that today, and I'm a technical female at Google, I don't see myself represented, even though our population is growing significantly. So my hope is that as we grow, that we band together and not divide, and that we start, going into these spaces where Latinos aren't at still in 2020. That is my hope for us in the future.
I think that's beautiful. And I also think along those lines, just with a lot of the young politicians being elected these days, there's Afro-Latinos, there's LGBTQ Latinos, there's a whole spectrum of folks, as Mario mentioned, with all these intersections of identity. And I think it's really encouraging to see these young folks and more women taking up leadership in our country. So I'm excited to see what folks do, seeing more Latinos, Latinas, Latinx gente in all these positions, across the government, and thinking, what policies do we have to support Latinos, to support the success as of all Americans, of immigrants, of treating all human beings with dignity and respect. And I think part of that is electing our folks as well to make decisions and be at the table.
Thank you to all of you for sharing your thoughts. We're not going to pivot in the next 20 minutes to questions from our audience. Again, if you haven't had an opportunity, use the chat box to put in your question there. Feel free to put in the name of the panelist if you'd like me to address it specifically. And we'll spend the next 20 minutes doing that. And at the end, we'll spend the last 10 minutes allowing our panelists to share with us their final thoughts as they think about the U.S. Hispanic Insights. So the first question, I think this might be addressed to you, Julissa. where should ERGs direct their efforts during the next few years? I mean, should they be more focused on educating our leaders? Are we considering the labor to be an issue that need more massaging, more explanation, or is this something that we just let organically happen?
Okay, so where do I think that we should move forward within the ERG is we do need more education. I think right now with everything that's happening in our country, from the Black Lives Matter movement to COVID to our political climate, I do think that there is an opportunity for us to address colorism if we're talking about Latino ERGs. And I think ERGs play a really important part in bringing forward those conversations on a national and global level. I also feel like as ERG leaders, we do a lot of cultural events and a lot of soft events. We need to focus more on the professional development and seeing how we can cultivate professional workshops that are catered particularly to Latinos. I know, Giovanni, you went through the ASER program. And for me, as going through that program, it was a revelation. I've never been talked to in that way, that use my cultural relevance and my cultural knowledge with my professional knowledge, professional relevance, and put it all together in one training. I feel like we need to do more of that. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question that I got here is, it seems that we focus in highlighting divisive topics. What are the topics that unite us as a community?
I'll jump in. Family unites us, our view of the closeness of family. Our language unites us. It's in some ways, it's unfortunate that we have one word that we're divisive about with one another when we have an entire language that actually does unite us, right? Our entrepreneurship right now unites us. You know, we are far and away the largest growth sector in the United States. There are more female, Latina women who are starting businesses right now than any other group of people. And so I won't even say Latinos, because it is the women that are starting all these businesses. They are empowered right now, right? So entrepreneurship, the greatest rise in home ownership in our country is among Spanish-speaking people, or Latinos, or Hispanics. Now I'm confused, Giovanni, you know? And so we are united by this desire to prosper together. That's the one, so this sense of passion that we have for life as well. We like to have a good time, man. That's a good thing. So many people right now are negative, we're stuck, but Latinos, no, we keep on partying, and it's a good thing.
Yeah, in fact, often that's what I warn ERGs about, right? Be careful with the 3 F's: fun, food, and flag. If we just make events about fan, food, and flag, we'll tend to miss the greater opportunity, which is around connecting with others, sharing that culture, professional and personal development. And my advice has always been include the food, fun, and flag, no doubt about it. Again, add this other layer of that's a little more business focused, a little more business minded, so that you attract a greater crowd. So really, really good insight there. Let's see. So, okay, I think Ricardo, you sort of addressed this earlier, and it was the concept of, if you were advising a C-level executive about the trends of you as Hispanic, right? And you specifically addressed that. Did anybody else want to chime in that concept? If you were a personal advisor to a C-level executive, and you were to say, hey, this is what you got to pay attention at this cohort, what would you say to them? David?
I'm going to jump in. David, you want to go?
Go ahead, Ricardo. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. I'm filling space. So,
Go ahead.
the best study that I have ever come across on niche marketing to our people was President Obama's first presidential campaign. And if you haven't seen this, he takes this one song and he puts it into mariachi, he puts it into Tex-Mex, he puts it into reggaeton, he puts it into, and it is the most, if you put it and piece it all together, and the genius of it was this uncanny ability. I don't know who his advisors were on that. It wasn't me, so I'll be upfront on that. But it was genius. And it was key, right? And if you listen to this, it was just, and I did a study on this, and I actually used to present on this. I think it's the absolute best study of niche marketing within our community. And I would just recommend everybody go out and find these music videos of what President Obama did in his first presidential campaign. It was pure genius.
I did not know that. I'm going to have to do this after this.
For 2,000 pesos, I'll send you that directly. See,
Thanks, Ricardo. Appreciate it. I had another question popped in here. How important is it for business leaders whose primary language is English to learn Spanish as a second language in order to attract and connect with the Spanish-speaking community? Mario, you have any data that shows any trends?
I mean, I can answer from a marketing perspective. I think there's other people on the board here that could, from an ERG kind of human resources perspective, could better answer that. I mean, so you qualified the Spanish, to connect with the Spanish-speaking population. I mean, it's extremely important, right? For marketers and brands to speak to Hispanics in Spanish if they're Spanish dominant. I mentioned kind of trends and happening in the U.S. Hispanic market. I mean, another trend is the importance of speaking Spanish and identifying as Hispanic or Latinx is dwindling, right? And that's and Ricardo can probably speak to this. I mean, from a cultural perspective, that's something that we've known, right? As you start to get second, third generation, as you start to get, more races, more languages, English is becoming the dominant language. So, while we do share a language, I think it is becoming overall, and as you go into younger cohorts, less important from a marketing perspective. That being said, we do, if we look at Spanish speakers in the US, I think Ricardo said we're second or third. If we were a Spanish speaking nation, second or third. So there's a huge, large percentage of the US Hispanic population that speaks Spanish. And if that's your target audience, it's extremely important to speak Spanish.
I remember, Mario, one of your reports talk about how younger Latinos are being digital Sherpas to order Latinos. Can you explain that concept and provide that insight?
Yeah, so the idea of digital Sherpas, we actually partnered with Ninth Wonder Agency. This was a concept termed by a great marketer, Maria Tuena, at Ninth Wonder. And this idea came that she had many brands coming to her and saying, hey, we're spending money on Spanish language advertising, but all the traffic that we're getting is coming in from our English language website. And so they use that data to cut Spanish language advertising online. And Maria had a theory that, well, I don't think that you should be cutting back on Spanish language advertising, because she theorized that Spanish speakers are looking at these ads and then asking family members, younger family members, to purchase it for them who are English dominant. And so we actually just completed a study last month that quantified that, and her theory was in fact correct, that a large portion of bicultural, bilingual Hispanics in the US are purchasing products online for older family members that are Spanish dominant, both in the US and their home countries. And so and all of us that have, you know, Spanish speaking relatives can probably relate to that, right? We've likely, if we have a Spanish speaking relative, have purchased something online, or maybe if it's not even purchasing, research something for a relative that isn't comfortable purchasing things online in English. And so it's a really great study that points to the collectivism too, right? In terms of helping out friends and family that are Spanish dominant.
Anybody else want to chime in?
I'll just say one thing on the issue of language. To me, there's one base question that somebody should ask themselves. And that is, do I want to connect with the heart? The first language, the native language, is the heart language. That's where I can get my deepest connection with another person. So if you want to be able to connect with Spanish-speaking people that their first language is Spanish, then the answer to that question is yes. If you don't, then the answer to that question is no. It's a very simple question to ask yourself. By the way, it's just as a side note, there are more first language Spanish speaking people in the world than there are first language speaking English speaking people. So we have to recognize how important this language is to the world economy. And even though a lot of Latinos do speak English, it's still the soul for a lot of people.
It's still pulling on the heartstrings, huh? And
Absolutely.
that reminds me, when I get emotional, the Spanish comes out, man. The Spanish comes out.
You cry in Spanish, huh?
Yeah. Somehow the Cuban comes out, even though I've been in this country already for 20-something years, you know?
Mm-hmm.
It still comes out. It's there, you know? So I do have one more question here. It seems like the trend is to add more and more labels. I'm assuming that what they're saying is, you know, Latino, Hispanic, Latinx, you know, Afro-American, you know, is the trend to add more and more labels or to consolidate into one universal label? What are the trends that you guys are seeing?
I think it's consolidation, or at least for me, identifying as Afro-Latina, it has to do with acknowledging parts of my upbringing, my culture, my ancestry, that the term Latino itself doesn't, because of the racial complexities within our countries. I don't think it's just people are, you know, making up all these terms for the heck of it. I think it's more people are trying to find in these very broad terms some kind of identity. Like they just want to fully identify with something. Does that make sense?
David, is identity fluid?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that last question.
It's identity fluid. It's the concept of identity. Is a fluid. Is it a fluid?
I mean,
change?
I don't know any studies per se, but I mean, I think in my own life, you know, as I mentioned earlier, I've used several terms to describe myself over time that have probably changed. I think right now what's really cool is people are listening. So I know you referenced before that time of the tragedy of Pulse. I remember at that time, all the national LGBT nonprofits organized like a group to ask Latinx leaders how to respond to this. What should they be saying about this tragedy? What should they be doing? And in that conversation, the activists from Orlando wanted to use the term LatinX. So actually all these mostly white-led LGBT groups put out the joint press release. And I just thought that was really interesting that they were listening and asking questions. What does it mean? And I think this time on race is really important as well in our country, that people are listening and to those folks most directly impacted by something and really putting leadership there and how we respond. So.
I love that.
I got one other question. too often Latinos are known as the silent minority. Can you explain why? Are we known as a silent minority? What is that?
I'm the loudest in my
Anybody
team.
ever heard this? I mean, we're pretty vocal.
Maybe they're referring to. I think that's typically described in terms of our voting patterns.
Oh.
In the U.S., that's what I've heard it. What was the question, though?
That too often Latinos are known as the silent minority. Why is that?
Because historically we haven't voted is the answer. I mean, that's in numbers equal to our share of the demographic in the U.S. But I do think with the pandemic, the current administration, the economic impact of those things. I mean, I think if there's any time to wake up the silent majority from a voting perspective, I think this is the year.
And I think what's also kind of going, campaigns putting Latinos, Latinas, Latinx people in leadership, hiring consultants that are making campaigns in language. My organization, we don't support any candidates, but there's a lot of articles on Bernie Sanders' campaign, hired a Latino-led firm to do there. So it wasn't like they were translating an English campaign later, right? But they started from the beginning talking about content. The same thing with voter registration groups. Are there Latinos? Are they investing in Latino-led, community-led, year-round, building that community to get people engaged on civic issues? So I think that's kind of a powerful thought as well, and having more of those voices included.
Julissa, you had something? Okay, sorry. Ricardo?
Yeah, I think I see it a little bit different culturally. First of all, we're the majority minority. I don't think we're silent. I think that over the last 20 years, the impact that Hispanics have made on America is profound. And maybe we're not, or historically haven't been as activist, It's interesting if you look at the US, right? So you had the Black experience primarily in the South and the East. It was on the East. It didn't get west of the Mississippi. And so you have everything that has to do with slavery and injustice, because there's a great amount of injustice, social engineering. You had the Jim Crow, the Crow laws, you had redlining, you had all that stuff, but it was primarily East Coast, right? And then when you got west of the Mississippi, it was the Mexicans, right? It's almost like there are two different countries that happened at the same time. And I think for me, we're all on this journey of really understanding, right? None of us have arrived at a full understanding of all of these dynamics, and I find it fascinating, Giovanni, that Abraham Lincoln and Benito Juarez were really good friends. And that if Lincoln had not been assassinated, Lincoln was very much against the Mexican-American War. If Lincoln had not been assassinated, most likely the United States doesn't annex that entire territory. It's a totally different world, right? And so it's so, to me, I think that the whole thing is so fascinating, right? But I don't think we're silent. I think we're making a profound impact on our world, maybe just in a different way.
I'm wondering if the reference here has to do with if when our community is offended, right, or when somebody says something negative about our community, or something happens and a social injustice happens to our community, do we organize with the same capabilities as other communities in this country? Do we organize with the same effectiveness? Are our voices being heard and being amplified with the same effectiveness as other communities in our country?
Cesar Chavez was a pretty good organizer,
Yeah, he was. But that was what, 40 years ago?
His impact was incredible. Now, has it been followed through? I mean, you have groups like, David, you're part of LULAC, right? I mean, it's not that there aren't major movements.
David?
I mean, I used to work for LULAC. Yeah, now I'm with Hispanic Federation. But I mean, I think so. Dolores Huerta is still organizing, and what is she in her 90s now? I think so. There's a lot of folks organizing, a lot of folks doing work. We're part of a coalition of 45 other Latino civil rights organizations, putting out federal policy agendas. I think what's cool right now about our moment, talking about racial injustice and other injustices in our country, I think folks are starting to realize if you vote in your local city, if you vote in your state up to president, all of these really have impacts on who's in charge in your city and your interactions with different public officials. So, I'm excited to see how can we be allies of the Black Lives Matter movement? How can we lift up those Afro-Latinx voices in our community? How can we understand that voting really makes a difference and what happens in your everyday life? So I think we got to continue, those organizers before us and keep organizing. Every time I hear Dolores speak, she's like, organize, 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 educate each other. And, we got to keep doing that work community by community.
And Julissa, you and I are part of ERGs, right? I mean, we are pretty active and pretty vocal in our respective ERGs, not only internally in our corporations, but also in the external work that we do. Assemble has given over $3 million worth of scholarships. That's external work. We've done over 45,000 volunteer hours every single year. That's external work. So it's a provocative question on whether the silent majority or not. I'm almost leaning with Mario in his assessment that this has to do with our voting, with our voting participation. But Mario, didn't we break records on voting participation for Hispanics in this past election cycle?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think it's been steadily increasing. I think what in reference though is just percentage of the population, right, compared to other groups. And Ricardo is right. We are making an impact, and there are states, counties that the Latino vote definitely has moved things. But I think just looking at overall percentage of registered voters or Latinos that can register, it's still, it's still lower than projections.
Okay. Well, folks, we got 5 minutes left. Thank you so much for all of those who hang in there with us. I hope you find our panelists' insights helpful. I hope they contributed with their knowledge, their wisdom to your day today. And I want to give the next 4 minutes now to each of the panelists to give us their final thoughts. And I don't want to pick one of you to go first, but do anybody want to go first?
Lisa, go first.
Hey, ladies first. Thank you. I want to thank you, Giovanni, for putting this panel together. I think it's a really important conversation that I think is on the top of a lot of people's minds. I want to say that there is not one answer for moving forward with one term for everyone. But I do hope that at least today we were able to shine some light on the differences and nuances on the different terms and the intentions behind them.
Thank you. How about you, David?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me and this great group of panelists. I think just treating all human beings with dignity and respect. I think that's where we want to be and where we want to go towards, including folks, supporting each other as human beings. And I think along that journey, there'll be a lot of interesting conversations, and it'll be fun to watch and evolve and see what happens with language over to 2050, as you said.
Yeah. Mario?
Yeah, thank you, and great meeting everyone on this panel. It's been a great conversation. I think it's cultural competency, like Ricardo said. I think we could all, whether you're in business, nonprofit, politics, government, we could all use some cultural competency to navigate, especially what's happening now, and inclusion for sure. So, read, we've done a lot of studies. We have a lot of free resources on thinknow.com. There's a lot of other studies, the work that Asemo is doing. Google actually has some great work on online behaviors, shopping habits. So, consume research. This is evolving, and I think we could all, benefit from that.
Last but not least, Ricardo.
Well, first of all, Giovanni, I celebrate you.
Thanks, Ricardo.
You gotta do this, right?
Yeah, you got a point. You got a point.
Oh my. We have to move beyond this kind of failed idea of cultural tolerance to cultural endearment. And there's a very specific process to get there. We have to transform our cultural mindset and our cultural skill set. It's time we move from cultural sensitivity to cultural skill. It's a difference, right? And our country is at kind of at a tipping point and maybe a breaking point. And we need to move beyond where we're at, but we have to transform who we are if we want to see in the aggregate real change. All transformation happens internally. And one of the greatest lessons I learned in life working with leaders was leaders who were culturally unhealthy and unskilled simply could never lead external transformation. They just weren't internally prepared to do so. So I think the real work has to start inside of us. That's with our mindset and skill set. And I just encourage everyone to just start giving some serious thought to really working on ourselves. Giovanni, thanks for putting this together. It was wonderful. Great panel.
Yeah, and that's as your moderator and host, it's been my honor, it's been my pleasure. And I hope that this inspires and instigates more dialogues. Don't bring together people that think alike. Bring together that have different perspectives. And always keep at the core of your framework, people are approaching all these different complex subjects from a place of honesty, from a place of authenticity. And if that's your framework, right, that would allow you to help you listen more acutely and more attentively to the other's perspective. And I think when we do that, we're going to find a lot of common ground instead of highlighting all the differences that do exist. We have more common ground than we have differences. I'm convinced about that, especially within our community. So thank you guys very much for joining us. We will take this recording, put it on our different newsletters, and if you would like to see the report of the survey that we have, email me and we send it to you. Thank you very much, guys. Adios.